Hi, everybody. So today I'll be talking about the drivers of accent bias in children, which is a cross-cultural study and also cross-linguistic that I'm really excited about, but some of this data is very preliminary, so just want to preface that the data collection is not completed for one of the sites. All right, so what is accent bias? Accent bias is basically the preference for a native speaker or a dominant speaker or a dominant accented speaker in the environment over non-dominant or non-mainstream accented speakers. And it is very well documented in both the adult and the child psychology literature. But to begin with the adult literature, we see that it really influences all aspects of everyday life. So anything from judgments of criminal guilt, where people who have the non-dominant or non-native, non-mainstream accent might be more likely to be perceived as guilty, to employability, where people might be less likely to get hired if they have a non-mainstream accent, to the quality of medical care individuals may receive, and also in the realm of academia, there have been studies that showing that teachers who have a foreign accent are rated lower on their teacher evaluations, and particularly accent is being mentioned as the reason why. So this bias is very strong and pervasive. We find this in the adults, and also it emerges at a really young age. So now it's become well documented that around age 3, especially in selective trust type of paradigm studies where children have to choose someone to be friends with or to learn from, they are always reliably choosing the native or the dominant accented speaker over the non-native one. And then Kinsler also showed that in some cases, this accent cue might also be stronger than other cues, such as racial cues. So children are able to update or change their preferences once they find out how the child actually sounds. And some of my earlier work showed that the effects of accent are also significant, even in the presence of other linguistic cues. So where I used certainty cues, such as I know versus I guess, which typically we know that kids are really good at going with the reliable speaker. In the case where accent is introduced into the equation, children were only selecting the reliable but accented speaker at chance. So it seems like a pretty strong bias. So if there is such a strong bias, the question arises of what the driver or drivers of this bias might be. And there's a couple of different explanations that exist. And in this talk and in this research program, I'm trying to kind of parse these different drivers. So one of the first drivers, and probably the most common, most talked about, is the social membership signaling property of accents. So basically, since accents are very local to the environment, it could be the nation, the city, the local group, they are a good signal of in-group membership. Somebody who is born there, who has been speaking that language with that particular accent, must be your in-group member. At least that's kind of what the argument is. And people who sound different, they therefore might be out-group members. So this is kind of this top-down approach, right? That like there's already this membership signaling property, and then also similarly to that, there's this idea that accents signal social status, which may elicit stereotyping, right? So particularly in the United States, which is what I'm more familiar with, is in this sense, is that accents can often signal socioeconomic status, immigration status, nationality, race, educational attainment, and all sorts of things. And that often leads to stereotyping as well. If you look like this, you might have an accent. It also might work that way. But what I'm most excited and interested in this accent bias literature is the possibility that accent bias also might arise from a bottom-up approach where we find that cognitive difficulty of processing a non-mainstream and unfamiliar accent is actually more taxing on your cognition, and therefore the listener might become frustrated and misattribute the frustration to the speaker instead of their speech. And so what I mean by this cognitive taxation is twofold, right? So the extended processing time, taking longer to understand speech, and then also the decreased processing accuracy, so making more errors in decoding the speech. So what I set out to do in the current research study is that to test these different hypotheses. So first, I was wondering whether children's processing difficulty varies across differently accented speech. Is it just native versus non-native, or are there different nuances about unfamiliarity versus familiarity with different accents? Are processing differences greater for foreign accented versus unfamiliar native accented speech? So these are kind of the processing side, the bottom-up approach questions. And then, does cognitive difficulty predict negative social judgment of accented speakers? So again, looking at whether this is where the bias is coming from, or part of the bias can be attributed to this. And then also, I had a little chance to explore, at least in the US side, the effect of linguistic exposure. So how you would think about other type of social biases where exposure reduces the bias. Is this the same? Is the case the same for accents? And then lastly, to what extent these patterns are similar or different across cultures and languages, and what these patterns provide insight into, right? So this is why I chose two very different linguistic cultural different sites to kind of explore that. All right, so a lot of the literature that I presented has been done in North America, particularly in the United States. So I really was interested in exploring this a little bit outside of the US. So I had two field sites, the United States, Austin, Texas, conveniently my university town, as well as Budapest, Hungary. And so in the US, we have finished data collection. We ended up with 68 4 to 6-year-old children. And in Hungary, we just started data collection right before the holidays, so we really only have 10 kids to show you, but more to come. And in the US, almost half of our kids had some exposure to linguistic diversity, which we defined by having at least 20% exposure to a foreign language or foreign accented English speech. In Hungary, so far, it's been one child. We also don't expect it to be major, but we'll see what happens. So I've been told that the audio doesn't quite work, so we'll see what happens. But in both sites, we had 3 different accents. In the US, we had the standard Native American English accent, which kind of served as our baseline. Let's give it a try. Okay, that doesn't work, so you have to just trust me on that. And then we had another native accented condition, which was this unfamiliar New Zealand accented English, which we thought that kids in Austin have minimal to no exposure to, so it would be unfamiliar, but still native, so phonetically might be closer and similar. And then lastly, we had a foreign accented speech, which was somebody whose first language was Turkish, and so they were English as a second language speaker. They had a Turkish accented speech. Excuse me. And then we chose Hungary, conveniently, as the second field site, where we had the native speech being the standard Hungarian accent, so a native speaker. Again, I don't think it's going to work. And then here we had 2 foreign accented speakers, because we had a hypothesis that unlike in the United States, where a lot of people come to the US and learn English and speak it to different extents and with different accents, in Hungary it's much less likely for someone to come here and learn Hungarian. And anecdotally, we hear that it's kind of perceived in a positive light if someone is trying to learn Hungarian, because we take so much pride in our language being so complicated and so hard to learn and all that. So we selected 2 different foreign accents, and we deemed that still there might be some status differences. So Russian accent in Hungarian, due to the historical nature of Hungary, excuse me, might be perceived as lower status, whereas the American English accent in Hungarian might be seen as higher. So in the first part, we set out to measure the cognitive difficulty, which was a word categorization task in PsychoPy, where kids had to decide whether things were living or non-living, so alive or not alive. And here we were measuring the processing time, the reaction time, and then the accuracy. And this is kind of what this looked like. Excuse me. So we had 3 different accents in each of the sites, and then they heard 20 words in each of the different accents. And it was randomized across both accent and also across living versus non-living. So this is what this looked like. We explained them in the familiarization phase that the blue was for living things and the red was for non-living things, and kids had a time to practice and make sure that they understood the task. And then they randomly heard one of the 60 words in one of the 3 accents. If they already heard the word butterfly, which was going to be my sample word, then they didn't hear that word in any other accents anymore. So each word was only played once, and then in total they heard 20 in each of the accents, 30 in each category, so I could create composite scores by accents. And then in the next part of the study, we measured the social bias, since we're interested in this connection between the 2. So in this part, children heard 3 short passages from the same... Oh, thank you, I also have. You have, okay. Okay, thank you. I'm okay. So children heard 3 short passages in 3 different accents, and we asked them how much they trusted or thought the speaker was credible, whether they thought the speaker was smart, and if they thought the speaker was nice. And so this looked like this. And then so once we asked the binary question, we also asked how certain kids were in their response. So how sure are you? And the options were a little sure, not so sure, a little bit sure, or very sure. And I'm really running behind time. So here are some preliminary results. So for processing accuracy, on the x-axis, this is the US side. On the x-axis, you see the different accents. So US, New Zealand, Turkish. And then the y-axis is our accuracy rate. So again, higher accuracy, meaning they are better at processing it, making less errors. Significant difference between the native and the non-native accent, but New Zealand and the US accents are pretty much sticking together, which is not so surprising. And then for our preliminary data in Hungary, we find that it seems like that the US and the Hungarian accent will separate, so there will be that difference, but it seems like that the Russian might stick closer to the Hungarian. For processing speed, here it's kind of the reverse. So again, here, higher speed means you're taking longer, it takes longer to process, so here we want lower scores. So we find that for the American native accent, it's easier to process, they're taking less time, significantly less time than they do for Turkish. And then, I don't know if you can say with 10 kids, but maybe similar trends are emerging in Hungary as well. In the US, I was able to look into this really interesting question of the role of exposure. And unfortunately, or not, I found that at least the cognitive processing part of accented speech was not moderated by having exposure. So here on the x-axis, you see the exposed and the non-exposed kids. And then you see their accuracy rates and their reaction times. And you can just see that the two are identical. So, so these two are basically identical as well as these. So it seems like there is pretty much no effect of accent or exposure. For social bias, we found in the US that the kids were much more likely to say that the American speaker was nicer and smarter than the Turkish accented speaker. However, we found no effect for trust. If you remember, the question for trust was, if you wanted to learn more about animals, would you like to learn from this person? And I think kids just love to learn about animals. So they were like, yes, and not so much concerning about who was speaking. So that might be why we found that. But interestingly, in the Hungarian side, we kind of starting to find a little bit different, but still along the same lines. But here the trust question comes out significant, where they are significantly more likely to want to learn from the Hungarian speaker, which might be driven by this accent bias or preference. And then in the US, where I parsed this bias by accent, by exposure, I actually did find an effect. So here we find, and I think this is kind of one of the most surprising and interesting results, is that having exposure to accented speech or foreign languages does moderate your social bias. So kids are displaying less social biases, but as you saw, not less cognitive difficulty. But the most important question that I set out to answer is whether this cognitive difficulty drives the social bias, or is there any kind of association. And we did find that in the United States, right? So we see that as kids are getting more accurate at word categorization, they are also rating the speaker as nicer, except for the native speaker, which is basically at ceiling because they are already super accurate. And then for the Hungarian one, I really can't jump to large conclusions here, but you can see that the native accented is already at a higher rate, which means that it's already at ceiling. So at least in that case, they are similar. So just to summarize before I run out of time, we find that children have more difficulty processing foreign than native speech, and also find that children exhibit social biases against non-native speakers, so this is nothing new. But we find that children with some exposure to linguistic diversity, at least in the US context, show less social biases. And overall, it seems, at least from the US data, which is a more complete data set, that the more difficulty children have with processing accented speech, the less they like the speaker. So it may not be only an in-group, out-group cue, but there also might be some of these bottom-up approaches happening, at least in childhood. I want to also add to this that I'm collecting adult data as well, which is not included in this talk, but I'm interested in seeing whether it might be different for adults than it is for kids. And with that, I'd like to thank my two main collaborators, PIs, Dr. Kathleen Eccles and Ildikó Király, and also all the RAs who worked with us, all the labs, the daycares, the families, and the kids, and everyone who made this possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajna. Thank you. And it's time for questions.
Hello, thank you. I was wondering, in the US accent group for the US kids, and same for the Hungarians, did you have regional variations of accents? Because in...
As in the children?
No, in like what they heard the accents of the words, right?
Yeah, so they heard, in the US, they heard 3 different accents, which was American, New Zealand English, and then Turkish accent in English.
Yeah, within the US category.
Oh, no. So it was someone who's also an Austin native and speaks a pretty standard, like not a super Southern accent that doesn't have any kind of particular markers, something that would be very familiar for the kids in the US, but yeah, we only had 1 speaker per accent.
So if you include that variation, would you see if it's a cognitive bias driving this, is the difficulty driving the social bias? If you include these regional variations, would you think that you would see the same effect?
I don't think so, only because in the New Zealand case, I would consider that almost as a regional dialect of English, right? And we don't see cognitive challenges or differences for kids are having or not having. So my hunch would be not, but maybe there are some other native accents, like Scottish, that might be harder even to parse.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hello. Thanks for the presentation. Am I audible? Yeah. Do you think the differences between in the results would disappear once the kids like become more mature and they grow a bit? I know you're doing a study for the adults, but do you think age is a predominant factor why we might be seeing these differences among young children? And maybe after 2-3 years, once they are more socialized into the environment, these differences might disappear?
Do you mean the social bias or the processing difference?
Both, like...
Both, okay. So the social bias definitely doesn't disappear because that's what the literature is suggesting, and that's also what our adult US data is suggesting. If anything, it does become a little bit more amplified, as it seems, right? A little bit more implicit, or people blame it on different things. Oh, I couldn't understand, and turns out when you ask them to write down what they heard, they can understand it exactly. So it seems like the social bias doesn't disappear, but I wonder if maybe the cognitive does, because as we grew up, we hear more different variations of speech, so we're more attuned to kind of understanding, more quickly understanding. I don't have the full data yet, so I can't speak to it on my side, but in the literature, it suggests that the bias itself is pretty pervasive, yeah.
I had a question about the exposure to different accents measure. Was that like a diversity measure, or was it specifically asking whether or not they were exposed to like the accents that you were testing on?
So we asked the parents to report how much of the time the kid hears any other foreign languages. So they listed that. If it reached 20%, they were automatically coded as having exposure. And then we also asked how much of the time the kids are hearing, like in a given week, they are hearing accented English. And so that was also coded. And we did not encounter any kids who were hearing Turkish accented or New Zealand English accented speech. So we didn't exclude anyone based on that. Did that answer your question? Okay. I think there's a question down here. Oh.
Thanks for that. That was really interesting. I'm curious. So you have this overall where the harder it is to understand, the sort of more negative the social evaluations are. Exposure to languages in general doesn't make this particular accent easier to understand, but exposure to accents in general does seem to soften that sort of social effect. So how are you interpreting this? That like having experience sort of parsing other people's accents makes me less frustrated when I'm doing that cognitively effortful interpretation?
Yeah, that's a very interesting way. I think you can interpret it twofold, right? Like maybe it is that you've had more experience doing like the parsing and the cognitive task of understanding variations of speech. So maybe you're just kind of used to it. That's your normal, that's your baseline to some extent. And I think the other one could be just like similar to like other social biases and the mere exposure effect, that like the more you see, the more you interact with people, you realize they're also human. They also have the same qualities as your native speakers peers might have. And so you kind of start seeing them as people, not as your outgroups or your stereotypes. Does that make sense? I don't know. I'm just guessing here too.
Okay, that was our time. So thank you again, Ajna.